I think we have two amendments proposed by Representative Eskamani. The first one we'd like to go over is barcode 543A2 from Representative Eskamani. You're recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you so much, Chair. And actually, I don't have barcodes. I have Amendment 2 and 3. Could you just read the first line so I know I'm on the same page with you?
It is the one that you have labeled number 2.
Perfect. That makes sense. Thank you so much, Chairman, Vice Chair, Whip, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come before you to present two amendments for your consideration on this bill. The first of which would be familiar to some members as it's a version of a bill that's been filed by including colleagues in this committee. Representative Chambliss, I believe you filed versions of this in the past. Senator Chev Jones, a friend of ours, has also filed versions of this. And it would simply be to create a community safety task force to help address community violence. Many members know that my twin sister was actually robbed last year in December by 4 juveniles. We worked with OPD to identify those 4. We're in the judicial process right now. It's very personal for me to focus on things like community violence intervention to keep kids not just safe in our schools, but also safe in our streets, because we do see a continuation of high activities of not just criminal activity, but unlawful gun ownership, particularly in communities that have been neglected over the years. So much like we have a task force to address safety in our schools, Chairman, this would be a task force to address community violence. If you look at the amendment, it is made up of positions that our governor would appoint alongside leadership of the Senate and President. The DCF Secretary would also have a position this as well, alongside the Police Chiefs Association and the Florida Sheriff Association. And so I do humbly encourage you to consider the amendment, and happy to take any questions that folks have.
Members, are there questions on the amendment? All right, seeing no question. Oh, sorry. Representative Henson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the amendment, Rep. Eskamani. Could you tell us how this amendment would make our community safer?
Yes, thank you so much, Chairman, and may I?
You're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. You know, there's actually been some really phenomenal work done in other states around interventions with community violence. This can include street outreach and violence interruption programs, hospital-based violence intervention programs, changing the environmental conditions that tend to lead to community violence, like poverty, alongside just more public investments in community violence intervention. As much hope as I have that violence will be reduced, I know that hope doesn't solve these problems. You need data. And much as we're taking recommendations from the MSD Safety Task Force, my intention with this is that we would be able to have an evidence-based approach, to solve community-based violence as well, which we know, especially post-pandemic, we are seeing a serious crisis with the mental health of our young people, alongside activities that get them into harm's way.
Are there any other questions? All right. Is there public testimony on the amendment? Yes. I have 1, 2, 3 appearance cards on this amendment. First up, Patty Brigham from Prevent Gun Violence, Florida. Waving in support. Thank you. Next up, I have Dennis Fields. Waving in opposition. Thank you. Next up on this amendment, Luis Valdez, Gun Owners of America.
Ladies and gentlemen of this committee, as the Florida State Director for Gun Owners of America and as a 15-year law enforcement veteran, this amendment in no way will resolve the public safety issues we have. We currently have a mental health crisis. We should have public funding for mental health, but this task force, this amendment, it won't do anything. And to answer some other questions, one of the esteemed members here asked about tourism. Florida has tourism.
Mr. Valdez, could you limit the comments to the amendment, please?
Yes, sir. We're against the amendment.
Thank you. Any other public testimony on the amendment? Any members wishing to debate on the amendment? Representative Chambliss, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Eskamani, for the amendment. I do encourage members to support the amendment because when we are talking public safety, if we are not having a conversation in that same breath about community violence, I think we're definitely missing the target. Because having our communities safe, the communities that endure violence on a day-to-day basis, that have situations to where children live in little mini war zones, they're traumatized consistently, whether it's having a situation to where we're not talking about the legal guns, but the illegal guns and the wealth of illegal guns that are currently available and that are used in these shootings to where, we have juveniles that have free access to them. A study to identify and to accurately measure that so that we can create proper responses to it, I think is definitely warranted. And I think it is important to identify the fact that that is a part of public safety. I think that it fits into the premise of this public safety bill. And I think it's an area actually where we would find a lot of uniformity across the legislature because we all want safer communities. The issue is that we haven't really identified, and remember, the lack of safety in these communities has existed for decades, but we still have not identified exactly what steps are necessary to make those communities safer, because if we did, we would be doing it, right? The statistics would have gone down. So since it has not been identified, one of the only ways to identify it would be to study it and to create measurables that can be achieved by community, by parents, by the school districts, by the law enforcement together. And I think that is why this bill is this amendment is an outstanding amendment. Again, community violence should always be in the conversation of public safety. Thank you.
Representative Hart, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, too, would like to say I know that this is an absolute necessity for communities, and especially communities of color. Every single week since I have been here in committee weeks over the past 6 or 7 weeks, someone has been killed in my district, blocks away from where I live. I would love to see some type of study done to help us determine what it is that we could possibly do to bring down the gun violence. So for us not to have that conversation and not be willing to put forth money to have such a task force to help us determine what's really happening with our kids is critically important to me. So I thank you for bringing this good amendment. And at some point, this isn't just my community. This is all of you all's communities everywhere. And at some point, it's going to hit yours like it's hitting mine. And then maybe at that point, you will be willing to have that real conversation and put forth money to help us determine what is it that we could do to bring down gun violence. So that's part of why I'm sitting here. I'm just so perplexed that we don't even want to have that conversation or put forth money to help us determine what is it that we could do. We study everything here in the legislature. So, Rep, thank you very much for the amendment.
Representative Eskamani, you're recognized to close on your amendment.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I just want to address some of the debate. The notion that assuming this amendment will not resolve the public health crisis we have here, I don't think that's a fair statement to make, but I would also argue that based on the lack of data to support the bill, you also can't say that about this bill. So if we're not using data to make a decision on legislation, I would encourage you to at least consider the good faith measure in me filing this amendment. There's many amendments I could file, but I chose to select two that I felt like were very common sense, that don't necessarily address any type of constitutional rights, but really just try to attempt to figure out what's going on. Because as Representative Chambliss, Representative Hart noted, community gun violence is highly concentrated, and this is consistent for generations, highly concentrated among a small number of people living in underserved communities who are often caught in the cycles of victimization, trauma, and retaliatory violence. And for generations, we've looked at policing to solve those crises by arresting more people, and that actually hasn't made any one of us more safe. So there has to be a different approaches with police a part of the conversation. This task force does include the Sheriff's Association, and the Police Chiefs Association, alongside members of the legislature, appointments by the governor, our DCF secretary, because it is an intersectional and multifaceted crisis. And I am concerned that this bill is going to make it worse. And so I do humbly ask for your support, and I encourage everyone to vote yes on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members, if you favor adoption of the amendment, signify by saying yay. Yay. Opposed, no. No. Lindsay, please. I'm sorry, I don't see any hands. By your vote, the amendment fails. Representative Eskamani, you're recognized to explain amendment number 3. And this is barcode for PCS HB 543A3. You're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps this one I will get some more yays. I first just want to offer a content warning, as this next amendment is about suicide. And for those who are in the room or watching on the Florida channel, if you or a loved one are experiencing suicidal ideation, I encourage you to seek support with 988, a line that you can call or text. And with that said, suicide makes up 3 in every 5 gun deaths. Suicide by firearm is almost always deadly. 9 out of 10 firearm suicide attempts have resulted in death. And every day, 64 Americans die by firearm suicide, 1 every 22 minutes. This amendment is actually mimicking what 3 other states have already done, Utah, Virginia, and Washington, in creating something that's referred to as a voluntary do not sell list. So if you are experiencing suicidal ideation, and are worried about your impulsive decision-making where you may seek to purchase a firearm and take your life with that firearm, this actually allows you to put your name into the background registry as a do not sell. Your information is private. It is not readily available, but what's really unique about it is when you feel like you are safe from yourself, you can actually voluntarily remove yourself from the list. And so it's not the same as a risk protection order where you go before a judge when there's evidence that someone is saying that you're at harm of yourself due to some sort of recorded activity, whether it's you've been involuntarily submitted to a psychiatric ward, so forth. This is purely voluntary. And it is named after a mom in New Orleans who unfortunately took her own life at the arms of a gun that she purchased herself, and simply will create that option for folks who might be experiencing suicidal ideation to, again, voluntarily decide they need that break. And then we did add a 6-month sunset to it, Chairman, because I was worried about the notion of someone being coerced to sign up for this. So by having a 6 months deadline, if you will, where you have to renew, it prevents that notion from happening. So that is the amendment.
Members, are there questions on the amendment? Seeing no questions, is there public testimony on the amendment? All right, we've got a couple of appearance cards. Dennis Fields. Mr. Fields, you're recognized.
Hello. This amendment is in a good nature. However, it creates undue work for the clerk of the court. It creates undue work for everybody that has to put in anything into NCIC and take it back out. It's just too much, and I can't support it.
Thank you, Mr. Fields. Next up, Luis Valdez, Gun Owner of America. You're recognized.
Thank you. Gun Owners of America is against this amendment for a number of reasons, but the largest is that once an individual is listed on these government systems, how are they taken off? Representative Eskamani claims that it's a 6-month period. As a former law enforcement officer, I've seen multiple times where individuals that were innocent, that were either on FCIC, NCIC, or on the NICS system, were misrepresented, mislabeled, and even with Senator Ted Kennedy in the federal no-fly list, it took him gargantuan efforts to be taken off that list when he was put there accidentally. We've seen on the federal level, and we've seen across states, that this amendment, this system is a way to con people into permanently stripping themselves of their Second Amendment rights. We believe this committee should vote against this amendment.
Thank you. Next up, Patty Brigham, Prevent Gun Violence, Florida. You recognized? Wave it in support. Thank you. Are there any members wishing to debate on the amendment? Representative Arrington, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative, for bringing forth this amendment. I definitely caught your line that you could have brought forward many amendments, but this doesn't do anything to mess with the bill or change the bill. But I did just want to mention I appreciate the first testimony and that this was good, a good idea, but that it would be undue work for the clerks. And I would just say if one person's life would be saved, I think that it would be easily worth those couple extra minutes. So I appreciate it and encourage my colleagues to vote up.
Representative Chambliss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also, thank you again, Representative Eskamani, for this particular bill. It is really interesting because if you never dealt with someone who is in such mental distress that they know if they are left unsupervised that they will cause harm to themselves, you might not understand why this is actually a great amendment. You have to experience that, and I have. I've experienced someone who literally did not want to, they did not want to be unsupervised. They were in such a state of depression. In this particular situation, it was, correct my language if I'm wrong, postpartum. It was after a pregnancy.
Oh, yeah. Postpartum depression.
It was after a pregnancy that they were in, and it wasn't necessarily a pregnancy that they had planned for and or wanted. And afterwards, they were in such a deep state of depression that they voluntarily gave up rights to their child and placed themselves in a place that can help, a clinical place that could help them. My point is that these states of mind are very real. And again, many times they're so real that the individual actually knows they are in that state. And so I do think that, you know, we need to acknowledge that suicides happen, from by people who are just like us, and it could be any of us. Nobody knows, what could happen to make, them go into that kind of situation. But again, I have experienced it. I've experienced it from a loved one. I've seen it, and that's why I do think that this is a great amendment, and I encourage you to support it. Thank you.
Representative Eskamani, you're recognized to close on your amendment.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much for the debate, Representative Arrington and Chambliss. I do appreciate it. And for the first person who spoke, I appreciate your comment as well, because it is offered in good faith, and I think if there are ways to tighten the process with the clerk of courts, I would absolutely be open to that, as our intention is not to continue to create bureaucracy or to con anyone. The intention really is to save lives. At my legislative office, especially during the pandemic, we received many phone calls from individuals in this state with suicidal ideation, folks who call us in crisis because they're navigating economic uncertainty, maybe a loss of a loved one, and it's very scary for that person at that time, and it's also very brave to say, I am not safe with myself right now. I need to ensure that I'm not going to cause harm to myself. And that's purely what this option is. And as I noted, 3 other states have already pursued it, and there is a bipartisan bill in Congress right now to do the same. So it really is an idea and a concept that, if anything, gives you more power over when you do feel comfortable owning a firearm versus not. And I believe the the Wall Street Journal, a fan favorite of many in this room, I'm sure, have called this a libertarian approach, because it does give that freedom for that individual to choose, with, of course, the accountability on the government side to make sure that someone is not accidentally left on the list. This is truly an intended effort to save lives, to help sure that those who are experiencing suicidal ideation can be here and seek help versus we lose them to gun violence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Members, if you favor adoption of the amendment, signify by saying yay. Yay. Those opposed, no. No. By your vote, the amendment fails.